Hey everyone, so let's move on with Thus Spoke Zarathustra into the second part. So the first section is called The Child with the Mirror, and all that happens here, Zarathustra has gone back to the mountain where he's hanging out with his eagle and his serpent, and then he dreams that a child stands before him with a mirror. He looks into this mirror and sees a devil's grimace and scornful laughter. And he realizes this is a sign that his teaching has been distorted. And so he resolves to journey back to where his friends are and give them more of his wisdom. And the next section then, that's pretty much it. It's just a kind of continuation of the story. The next section, Upon the Blessed Isles, is basically about atheism, and he repeats several times that God is just a conjecture, but our conjectures should not extend beyond our creative capacities, and they should also be restricted to what is thinkable. And he says, since we can neither create nor think a God, we ought not to entertain such conjectures. And he says something interesting about the ubermensch here as well. We can't recreate ourselves into ubermensch. But what we can do is make ourselves the fathers and forefathers, or mothers and grandmothers, foremothers, of the ubermensch. So we can be the ancestors to the ubermensch, but we can't turn ourselves into ubermensch. So again, just reinforcing that idea, coming back to this recurring theme of the ubermensch, that there's something that will come later. There's something that we're not on a mission to become ubermensch. We're on a mission to get out of the way and create the future generations who will be the ubermensch. He also, at the end of this section, criticizes the notion of God because it praises eternity and permanence, when precisely the opposite is what is meaningful for Nietzsche, namely time, becoming, and impermanence. So, there's a lot of, obviously Nietzsche is an atheist, and he disagrees with God, not just because he thinks God doesn't exist. I think that's probably a lesser, that's probably not the most important reason for him. The most important reason is that venerating a God, or having worshipping a God, is disempowering. So I think that's his main objection. And so with the notion of God comes all these things: eternity, permanence, life everlasting, and a heaven and afterlife. So all of these things discount the now, they discount the earthly, they discount becoming and impermanence, and these things are what makes life meaningful for Nietzsche. The next section is on the pitying, and he just attacks pity. I've talked quite a bit about this already, I think, so we can just move through this section quite quickly. He doesn't like pity, and he talks about pride here being important. So when someone takes pity on you and helps you, the implication is that you lack the power or the strength to handle the situation yourself. So the quote is, "When I helped him, I transgressed grievously against his pride." And pride is not a bad thing for Nietzsche. Pride is we should be proud of ourselves. We should have pride. He sees it as a positive thing, not as something bad. And in addition, as I've said, pity or feeling sorry is weak and negative and kind of shrinking, inward focusing reaction to suffering that shrivels the one doing the pitying. And again, so when one pities, one doesn't stand nobly strong and embrace life and rise to the challenge and call others to rise to the challenge as well. Instead, it's kind of a shutting down, closing down, a rejection of a life that is difficult, or a circumstance that is unpleasant. Beggars, he says, are particularly distasteful because they deliberately try to evoke pity. They make themselves appear pitiful, which isn't that great. So his counsel here says, if I can quote him, if you have a suffering friend, be a resting place for his suffering, but a hard bed, as it were, a field cot. Thus will you profit him best. So he's not saying don't pity because that's helping, it's generosity. He's not saying be tough, make them, he's not advocating the opposite of pity in the sense of not caring about other people. He's not advocating hate for other people or even indifference towards other people. He is saying, however, that pitying them won't help them, and it doesn't help you either. The best way to help them is to support them, but be hard about it. Let them stand up on their own 2 feet, and encourage them to do that, and assist them where you can, but not so much that they become dependent on you, where they lose their sense of empowerment and their will to strive. Okay, so I think I'll leave that section there. The next section is on priests, and here he says he has a little bit of compassion for priests because they've been deceived by the Redeemer, presumably Jesus, who put them in fetters of false values and delusive words. So he's also disgusted by the way that rather than allowing themselves to soar, free, powerful, rather they, as sinners, they feel they have to crawl upstairs kind of on their knees before their Redeemer. And this is an obvious allusion to that central teaching of Christianity, which says we're all sinners. None of us deserve redemption, but because of that, if we ask for it, we can get it from God or from Jesus. So it's he's definitely not into that kind of attitude, and maybe you could argue that aspect of Christianity has kind of disappeared recently, but that was there, right? This isn't, Nietzsche's not making this stuff up. That is what Christianity taught. That's what the priests taught. We are inveterate sinners, and we don't deserve it, but through the grace, divine grace, we can be redeemed. So obviously the complete opposite of what Nietzsche's about. And an interesting section, he talks about the priest's lack of knowledge, saying that it's full of gaps, and into these gaps they've slotted their God. So it's a little bit like that God of the gaps, the God of the gaps criticism of religion. The quote is, he says, "They themselves have never walked on the carpets of knowledge. Of gaps was the spirit of these redeemers made up, but into every gap they put their delusion, their stopgap, which they called God." So yeah, so they're not striving for knowledge. They're not trying to understand. They're just, anytime they come up with something they don't comprehend, they stick God in. And that's a common argument made against religion. And again, coming back to the ubermensch, he says here that there has never been an ubermensch yet. So there's no point in looking through history to see who qualifies for this rank that Nietzsche has here, the overmen, the ubermensch, because there haven't been any. This is something that's coming. This is something that it can come if we take the appropriate steps, but it hasn't happened yet. And the quote is, "Naked I saw both the greatest and the smallest man. They are still all too similar to each other. Verily, even the greatest I found all too human." So ubermensch is something that's coming, something that we will create, but there hasn't been an ubermensch yet. We can't become ubermensch. That's it's for a future generation. The next section is on the virtuous, and it's basically an analysis of virtue and what it has come to mean, or a discussion of virtue. And he says a number of things, but some of them I'll just pluck out for you. He criticizes those who want reward for their virtue. So, especially one would imagine an eternal reward. So that shouldn't be the goal here. Virtue, you're not virtuous to get something back. He criticizes those who call it virtue when their vices grow weary. So in a way, it's like becoming virtuous by default. You just lose some of those the traits or drives that you have labeled negative over time, and then because you've lost them, now suddenly you think you're virtuous. So he criticizes that. He criticizes those who think virtue is merely pulling back from the world, kind of distancing yourself from things, and that they avoid those who would attack them, and they also avoid having to attack other people. Sorry. So they call that virtue. And Nietzsche criticizes that. And also those who cannot see the best in people, but see only the worst, and they call this seeing the worst in other people, they call that a virtue. So he criticizes those as well. In the end here, he says almost everyone believes they possess some virtue and knowledge of good and evil, despite the fact that most of them don't. And he says an interesting thing here. He particularly dislikes the words revenge, punishment, reward, and retribution. And for him, these words share no part in virtue. So a couple of interesting things there. So the first thing is, Nietzsche isn't against virtue. He's not against the good. He's just against the idea that virtue is fixed or it's absolute, that we get our virtue told to us. What we learn what virtue is from other people. Rather, he's not against virtue, but he thinks we need to decide for ourselves, create our own values. And secondly, revenge, punishment, reward, and retribution, those things are all negative for Nietzsche, because they all reflect a kind of life denying or inhibiting or restrictive attitude. Revenge, to take revenge, suggests that another person, the person who maybe wronged you, is stronger than you, is better than you. So you have to get back at them. And so it's kind of a weak, undermining response. Punishment as well. He's talked about punishing before. We should revel in a little bit of punishment. We shouldn't avoid it. But again, the punishment he's talking about here is a getting back at someone for something, punishing because they did something. That's not what Nietzsche sees as being virtuous. And reward and retribution as well, obviously, that plays no part in this. There shouldn't be any virtue isn't to get something back, and it's not retribution. It's not, again, it's not taking exacting punishment for something, or facing punishment and then because you're afraid of that punishment doing something else. Creation should be wholly positive rather than trying to avoid some kind of unpleasant situation. And he also here explicitly denies that what makes an act good is that it is unselfish. So we should, rather he says, we should always strive to ensure that ourselves are in all of our deeds that would guarantee their goodness. And that's kind of interesting, and it's a pretty cool take, I think. So, we're taught that to be unselfish is good, to not think about yourself first, to consider other people. But he's saying that's taking things around the wrong way. Rather, we should ensure that ourselves are in everything we do. We have our full selves, good and bad, what's good and bad in everything we do. And that makes them good, which is novel, if nothing else, right? So the next section is on the rabble, and this is a criticism of the rabble, or the herd, as lustful, lowly people who poison everything with their attempts to stifle the strong, the noble, the brave. And he points to some individuals who have turned away from life, or he points to some people who have turned away from life when he says they were really only turning away from the rabble. And perhaps this is a reference to Schopenhauer. So, Schopenhauer turned away from life. He denied the will to live. But in actual fact, what he was really trying to do was just turn away from the rabble. So he erred in that. And others appear as annihilators, when again, they're not actually annihilating, they're just trying to thwart the rabble. It's a reaction to the rabble. So these are kind of insufficient responses, and it's because they've been their philosophy, their direction has been turned around to thwart, to overcome the rabble, rather than to move forward positively. It's like a negative response. My stomach's going crazy, if you can hear that, sorry. Zarathustra also says he turned his back on those who rule when he saw that what they now call ruling, he says, is a higgling and haggling for power with the rabble. So this is pretty clear reference to democracy and how rulers have lost their ability to and deservingness to rule, because they can no longer take it and just rule outright. Rather, now they have to negotiate, higgle and haggle with the weak, with the rabble. And this, for Nietzsche, is a very shameful situation indeed. The next section is called On the Tarantulas. And the tarantulas is the metaphor here for those who preach equality. And they preach the will to equality as a virtue, but in actuality they're full of envy and jealousy, and they're always seeking revenge. Revenge against those whose equals they are not. Because secretly they're envious of those people, of those who are better than them. And they say that the will to equality is virtue, So Nietzsche is not for this idea of equality. He thinks that people are fundamentally not equal, and that's the way it should be. And he's for this distinction between those who are better, those who are stronger, those who are more noble than others. So he is definitely elitist. There's no doubt about that. And the whole ubermensch thing is really, it's all about elitism at its core. And he thinks some are just destined, if you like, to rule, whereas others are destined to follow, to obey. For he says here, the quote is, "Men are not equal, nor shall they become equal." Yeah. So yeah, against equality, against this idea of a leveling down of where people are considered the same. Yeah. He goes on to talk more about the warring and the inequality of the ubermensch. But again, so I talked about war, and when Nietzsche talks about war, he's not always talking about physical violence. And again, here he qualifies this idea of the ubermensch fighting amongst themselves and warring amongst themselves by saying, "In their hostilities they shall become inventors of images and ghosts, and with their images and ghosts they shall yet fight the highest fight against one another. Good and evil, and rich and poor, and high and low, and all the names of values, arms shall they be." So, they're doing battle, but not with guns and clubs, but with values, with names, with opinions, good and evil, rich and poor. So he's not. I can't imagine that Nietzsche is against violence as such, but he's not for it. He's not for gratuitous violence. He's not a warmonger. He just sees that kind of struggle, that kind of competition, as a positive thing, as something which benefits the victor and the loser. So it's just all a positive process for Nietzsche. And he concludes the section affirming that sentiment, the glory and never-ending conflict in creation, when he says, quote, let us be enemies too, my friends. Let us strive against one another like gods." So there's that. That's this. That's what Nietzsche's all about. Is this struggling, this striving, this positive thirst for more, to be greater, to be. To get more, to have more, to be more. Yeah. So that's that section. I think that's enough there. On the famous wise men is the next part. And the wise men he's talking about here are those who have elected to serve the people instead of the truth. And I think he's talking about priests here. And that'll become clear when I explain a little bit more. He says that these people, these wise men, have promoted themselves, and they've often claimed that the voice of God came to them. And then once they've ingratiated themselves with the people, then the rulers, the kings who wanted the people's support, then had to get these wise men on board as well and put them in positions of power. So that when I explain further, that makes it seem pretty much exactly like the priests of the Middle Ages, who often had wielded power comparable, if not greater than, some kings. So yeah, he's obviously not that impressed with that whole setup. And he calls these well-fed wise men who dwell in cities with all the comforts and that comes with that. Um, he derides them in favor of real truth seekers who prefer isolation and can be found in the desert. So these are the ones who, back to that idea of the marketplace and the flies. The real truth seekers don't seek fame and attention and glory. They are just, they have their own purpose, their own, and that's enough. That's why they do what they do. They don't do it to get adulation or to get to money or fame or power or anything like that. Power, but they just do what they do because that's what life is for them. They've embraced life completely, and that's what life is fundamentally. It's this striving towards a higher truth. Okay, famous wise man. The next couple of sections are require a lot of interpretation. So I've just tried to extract from them what I think is the key message. So the next part then is called the Night Song, and I see this as being basically an ode to night told from the perspective of the light. So the light is envious because it's only able to give, never receive. It's always giving of itself, giving light. And this perpetual giving has rendered the act of giving insignificant. It's kind of robbed it of any meaning because it's just always doing it, and it has to do it. It's always giving light, giving of itself. So the quote is, I do not know the happiness of those who receive. My virtue tired of itself in its overflow. And even those who receive from the light, they no longer appreciate the gift. The quote is, they receive from me, but do I touch their souls? So, yeah, an ode to night, perhaps a reference to the darker, deeper parts of ourselves, the passions, the desires that we try to, or that we're encouraged to suppress or restrain, and perhaps that's what Nietzsche's getting at there. The next part is called the Dancing Song, and here Zarathustra converses with life and wisdom, and he says to life that he loves her but finds her unfathomable. And she says she's not unfathomable, she's merely changeable and wild. And then he goes on to talk about this with wisdom, who is also a woman. And she says that the only reason he praises life is that he wills, wants, and loves. So what I get from that is that he doesn't really love life for life itself, as life itself. He loves what life gives him. It gives him the opportunity to will, want, and love. So he says, so anyway, that's the way it stands. He loves life, but is well disposed towards wisdom. And he's well disposed towards wisdom because she reminds him so much of life. She is changeable and stubborn, and although, quote, one thirsts after her, one is never satisfied. And then he goes back to tell life about wisdom, and she merely laughs and asks if he isn't actually talking about her, because the two seem so similar. So I get two takeaway points from this. One is that life and wisdom are connected. There isn't a big distinction there, right? They're both changeable, wild, kind of something you yearn for and you never get enough of. And the other take-home point is that life is supposed to be vibrant, unpredictable, exciting, carefree, all of those positive, dynamic things that Nietzsche, that fill Nietzsche's philosophy. The next part is called the Tomb Song, and again, difficult to interpret, but my take is that it's Zarathustra remembering his past hopes and dreams. And at that time, he was full of youthful exuberance and kind of grand hopes for the future, but they have since died, and these are the tombs that he's referring to. Yet there is still something within him that carries on, something invulnerable, and that's his will. And he calls this the shatterer of all tombs, because it's their will is continually striving. It destroys old goals, but in the process it creates new ones. So anyway, that's what I get from the tomb song, kind of a metaphor for the will to power. And the last section I'm going to look at in this video, and I'll continue this the second part in another video. The last section here is on self-overcoming. So he talks here about what he calls the wisest, and I think he's referring to philosophers here. And he says that they call their drive a will to truth, which is what philosophy means. Philosophy means love of wisdom, right? So that's what they purport to be doing anyway, is driving towards truth, trying to understand and know truth. Nietzsche questions this, though. Rather, he says, and I'll quote this, that they have a will to the thinkability of all beings. You want to make all being thinkable, for you doubt with well-founded suspicion that it is already thinkable. So that's an interesting passage, and he's criticizing contemporary philosophers, and I guess he would have in mind people like Leibniz, Kant, and Hegel, among others. And what they're trying to do with their philosophy is not to understand the way things are, the way life really is. They're trying to make it conform to the way they want it to be. They want to reduce life, which is this exuberant, untamed, untamable, dynamic kind of expression, force, whatever words you want to use. But they're trying to make life ordered and rational, when fundamentally it isn't. It's irrational. It can't be encompassed by rational thought. And so they're trying to do this, but they realize, I mean, the reason they're trying to do this is that they know it isn't this way already. So they're trying to force it into these categories, force it into some ordered, complete system, which it isn't. So then the fact that they're trying to do this then means that their will, their drive, isn't a will to truth, rather it's a will to power. So they're not actually trying to find the truth. They're trying to impose their truth on life, on the world. And in doing that, anytime you try and bring your truth to something, that is an expression of the will to power. So their denial that they are engaged in this will to power is, or even while they deny that, they are engaged in it through their attempts to make of life this ordered, rational system. So I thought that's a really interesting thought. And on top of that, these wisest men, these philosophers, then promote their valuations, their assessments of good and evil, and or try to make other people hold to them as well. Again, will to power in action. So he's saying that he sees the will to power even in philosophers who claim that they're just after the truth. They're just trying to understand life. he sees the will, a will to power through them. He sees the will to power moving through them. He also goes on to make an observation on all living things, and he has three things to say about this. First, whatever lives obeys. Second, he who cannot obey himself is commanded. And third, commanding is harder than obeying, because in commanding one carries all the burdens and responsibilities, even when it commands itself, because it's still, then it must become the judge, the avenger, and the victim of its own laws. So that's worth dwelling on just for a moment too. Whatever lives obeys. So everything obeys something. And even if it's one's own will, one's own desires, there's an element of obeying there. So everything obeys. That's his first insight. Secondly, if you can't obey yourself, then you are obeying other people. So you're commanded by other people. So you're accepting other people's mandates instead of your own. So that's the second thing. And third, commanding is harder than obeying, because you have the burden and responsibility that comes with it. And even when you're commanding yourself, so you can be both commander and obeyer, I think is the key point here. And you should be. But often we don't, right? We don't obey ourselves. And what Nietzsche's getting at here is our own drives, our own urges and desires and passions. We crush them, we restrain them, we limit them. We don't want to let them out, so to speak. And in doing that, we're not obeying ourselves. We're obeying other people. Other people tell us that we ought to behave in a certain way, and so we do. So that's the second point. When you can't obey yourself, you become commanded by others. You obey others. So anyway, those are the three points about all life that he observes. And then he goes on to say, how does this process play out? What's the mechanism behind it? And he says the mechanism is this will to power. The quote I have is, "Where I found the living, there I found the will to power." So Nietzsche sees the will to power as something that is everywhere in all living things. It's at the heart of life itself. And even, he says, even in the weaker who serve the stronger, they also, the weaker, still have this will to power because they want to be master over those who are weaker than themselves. So the will to power it's always there. So yeah, it's kind of elevating that to almost like a law of nature. Anytime life exists, there will be this will to power, and that is really that's a Schopenhauerian idea. Will. Schopenhauer had this idea of the will as a blind kind of raw desire or an urge that was always present in life, and but he saw it as a will to life, to existence, and Nietzsche will disagree with that, but it's the same idea. The Schopenhauer's will was irrational, so he was rebelling as well against people like Hegel, and Nietzsche completely picks up on that, although he changes a little bit, which we'll talk about in a moment. So he also says here that all life sacrifices itself for power, and he expresses this succinctly when he says that life is that which must always overcome itself. And so this is the reference to the title of this section on self-overcoming, right? And he says we call this the will to procreate, or a drive to an end, to something higher, farther. And this is what the will to power is. So it's just worth dwelling on this point as well. What does he mean by overcome itself? So it's self-overcoming. You can interpret Nietzsche in a little bit in a way which I think he wouldn't have agreed with here, to mean something like overcoming your own weaknesses, identifying things that you're not good at and working to be better at them. So almost self-helpy in a way, or new agey even. But I think there's definitely, and there are places where he says something like that. We are artists, and the work of art, the masterpiece we're creating, is ourselves. So he does have that element a little bit, but in this section, I'm sure he's not talking about anything like that. This is when he says overcoming itself, life overcoming itself. He's talking about pretty much getting out of the way for the next generation to come through. The next generation who are more able, who are better, who are stronger, who are better equipped to deal with life and take life by the horns and make of it what they will, create for themselves. So life overcoming itself in this way is kind of taking a big stepping back and taking a bird's eye view, not focusing on the individual, but on, say, the species as a whole, and how it overcomes itself. The individuals overcome themselves in the way that they basically step aside and let the better new generation come through. And I think this is at the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy, this idea of continual progress towards, ultimately, for humans, the ubermensch, right? So that's what he's talking about with self-overcoming. And that harkens back to the very beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra too, right? Where he talked about the bridge to the overmen, to the ubermensch, and going under to cross it. And I think I spoke about that going under meaning basically die out, so that the next generation can come forward. And here, Nietzsche's just kind of elevating that to a general principle that holds across all life. Self-overcoming. I hope that's clear. That's what he's talking about with self-overcoming. Then he goes on to, I just said that Nietzsche took Schopenhauer's idea, that irrational will, and ran with it, but he does change it in that he's no longer arguing like Schopenhauer that this is a will to existence. He says that's impossible, and his argument is, if I quote him, "For what does not exist cannot will, but what is in existence, how could that still want existence? Only where there is life is there also will. Not will to life, but, thus I teach you, will to power." So he's saying something that exists, only something that can. Let me start again. He's saying only a thing that exists can will in the first place. So why would it will to exist when it already exists? It doesn't will to exist, it wills to power, to more, to greater. It has a thirst to be more than it is, to power. Again, we'll go back a little bit. All evaluations of good and evil are transitory, so there are no absolute eternal values. And the reason for this is because those values must continually overcome themselves again and again. Back to this idea of self-overcoming, this time with values. Values never stay the same. They're not eternal. They aren't absolute. They change with different people, with different cultures, with different societies. They change, and when they change, they overcome themselves. The old values step aside, and the new values come to the fore. As we decide and continually create. And once again, he reminds us that whoever must be a creator, or whoever wants to be a creator, must first be an annihilator and break values. Thus, the highest evil belongs to the highest goodness, but this is creative. So the highest evil being destroying, and the highest goodness being creating. But the two come together. So you can't have creation without destruction. Okay, that took a while to get through, and this video has already cracked the 40-minute mark, I think. So let me stop there, and next video we'll pick up the second half of the second part. Okay, thanks for listening anyway. I hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you shortly.